Welcome to the panel. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that this talk is taking place on the lands of the Kulin Nation and pay respects to their elders, past, present and future, and recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded. This panel looks at the curating and collecting of interactive software by museums and galleries, a project that's happening around the world as we speak. This is an Australian project with the Australian Centre for the Moving Image and a group of researchers across some Victorian universities. So before we start, I would like to introduce you to our panel, and I will introduce them as they appear. My name's Helen Stuckey. I am at RMIT University and I'm part of the preservation team. Our panel consists of Seb Chan. Seb is the Chief Experience Officer at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, so very much responsible for ACMI's vision around the collection and exhibition of video games. Nick Richardson is the Collections and Access Manager at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image. That's Nick there on the left in his underground bunker, where you can see it's full of film, and he seems to have trapped some poor unsuspecting cinephile down there. Dr. Denise de Vries. Dr. Denise de Vries is a computer science researcher at Swinburne University and a member of the UNESCO Persist group, who are the platform to enhance the sustainability of the information of society transglobally. So she's part of the software technical task force looking at the preservation of intangible culture with UNESCO. Our panel, Dr. Cynde Moya. Cynde is a postdoctoral fellow at Swinburne University, and she specialises in software preservation and digital archiving. And she was previously the software preservation manager at the Living Computer Museums and Labs in Seattle. And you can see here surrounded by some giant old supercomputers full of valves and knobs and other exciting things. So her expertise in computing is quite extensive. Also joining us is Candice. Cranmer. She's the time-based media, art and AV conservator at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, a new breed of conservators that have been joining collection staff across Australia. And there's me. I'm at RMIT University, where I teach into the Bachelor of Design, Games Design, and I was a video games curator at ACMI. All right, let me introduce you to the scale of the team. So this is all of us, and you can see we're broken across various areas, but the key partners are RMIT University, Swinburne University, the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, the Australian Academic and Research Network, which is RMIT. So RMIT built the original internet in Australia way back when it was just a place for strange computer scientists and dungeon adventurers and muds. And now they run the largest kind of not-for-profit research network for the greater good. So they are very good friends for us to have. And also UNESCO Persist. As I said, Denise is a member of the UNESCO Persist team. She's also been heavily involved with the Open SLX group, who work out of Freiburg University, doing pioneering work as Emulation-as-a-Service. So you can see them listed there. Now, the aims of the Play It Again project are to research the history of Australian games of the 1990s, their production and their reception. And this is something that this is the part that I'm involved in, and this is looking at the history of Australian games, so interviewing developers, interviewing players, because we're really focused on understanding games, how they were played at the time, and how they were played with. So not just how people played the games, but the other kind of community activities that surrounded gameplay and games cultures in that period. And so one of the key points of our research project is we work in conjunction with fan and gamer communities. And what you can see that on the slide, just a little image grab of a Discord for a Dark Rain Discord, which I took last night. That's a group that continue to play Dark Rain decades and decades later actively. So we work closely with fan and gamer communities, so we really understand games as played and all the kind of tacit knowledge and appreciation of games that these communities hold. And I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but people like James Newman, when they talk about games preservation, they suggest there's no point even in saving the software, that really it's the played game that matters, and we would be much better off just preserving things like video of gameplay and fan walkthroughs. But here at Play It Again too, we want to do both. We want to make sure games are accessible to the future, but also that we really understand how they were played at the time. And in the 1990s, Australia made a lot of really interesting games. It was a fascinating time for video games production. There was enormous changes with the possibilities of processing power and graphics fidelity. Networked gameplay came in. So it was a time of great dynamic change in games design and the games industry. There was also a lot of stuff that happened around things like full motion video, which we also explore, looking at games like The Dame Was Loaded, Australian game stroke interactive film that came out at the time. And of course, we've got some fantastic Racing Australia there, some very Australian focused games. And at this point, I just want to throw to Seb Chan, because he was a games journalist at the time working on the Australian Hyper magazine. So perhaps if I can introduce Seb and he can talk about some of his memories of game culture at the time.
Sure, thanks, Helen. Yeah, it was a fascinating period. I sort of was a freelance journalist in the 90s, writing for various music and gaming magazines and computing magazines. And I guess what was fascinating during that period was, as Helen said, the birth of the 3D graphics cards and all of the hardware kind of modifications you needed to physically make specific tweaks and choices. It was a very hands-on period, and I think that's what's quite exciting about the shift to preservation with emulation now, is that there's a lot of those very specific skills that need to be passed on to future generations, that were really at the heart of playing and also writing about and reviewing games. Then, you know, physical boxes of games would be mailed out to you, and they'd have CD-ROMs, and some of the Australian ones would have elaborate maps and manuals, things that we don't even think of as part of games kind of nowadays, with digital distribution and the sort of minimization of the physicality. But games in the 1990s and reviewing them was very much a physical experience, and a time-consuming physical one.
Thank you, Seb. So in this era, a lot of things were happening in Australia. The Australian dollar was very low compared to the US dollar. And there was a lot of talent here. In fact, a lot of talented developers returned from working in countries internationally, to come back to Australia to set up companies here. So there was a lot going on. And a lot of it was also fee-for-service work. So ports to things, mostly handheld game devices, a lot of porting to handheld games devices, and also a lot of what people affectionately call shovelware. So games to hit the Christmas market with film and TV tie-ins and things, often made before like the films were actually made themselves, so they could hit the same release dates. So, and some of those are incredibly ingenious games, and some of them not so much, but still something we're collecting, because it's a really important part of understanding Australians' games history. So, furthermore, our other aims, in addition to collecting this kind of social history, this history of games production and how games are played, is to develop a collection of video games from the 1990s that can be accessed in the future. So this is very much keyed towards software preservation aims. And we really want to do, as part of this project, to explore how Emulation-as-a-Service can support ongoing access to playable games for exhibition and research. So this session is very much focused on what it means to collect and curate historical interactive software. The panel is going to scare you about just how vulnerable your software is, And then we'll take you through some of our processes that we use to save video games for future researchers and audiences. And we'll look at a few case studies of different games and the different challenges that they create. And these will be obviously Australian games, and we hope you remember them fondly. And then we'll look at how Emulation-as-a-Service could be a game changer for digital heritage. So first up, I'd like to introduce Nick Richardson, the Collections Manager at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, and ask Nick about exactly how vulnerable are video games of this era.
Thanks, Helen. Hi, everyone. I think the first thing I wanted to say is that as a national museum, ACMI recognises the value of video games as a legitimate art form, and we don't distinguish between high forms of art and low forms of art. We recognise that it's important for a museum like us to celebrate, explore and critique this really important form of the media that we celebrate as the Australian Centre for the Moving Image. And while access is at the cornerstone of what we do, we very much see our preservation activities as leading towards an access outcome. There's no doubt that the irony in what we do is that the more contemporary forms of the moving image are in fact the most vulnerable. So those formats, those articulations of the art form that rely on electronic delivery rather than a mechanical delivery are those that really are the most challenging to preserve. So, you can in fact still screen film that's 100 years old that requires a mechanical device, a light source and a lens in order to generate access. The problem we've got here is that the delivery of the art form is entirely dependent on electronics, and we know that they are vulnerable. We know that they become obsolete, but we also know that they develop their own technical problems. One of the great challenges we've got at the moment is exploding capacitors on video game consoles. I think probably many of the audience would remember the problem with the Samsung phones. We have artworks and games that are reliant on that as a delivery platform. We've also got the problem then of the degradation of the cassette, the floppy disk, the cartridge themselves. So we really are racing against time to extract the data from the original delivery platform and create a playable emulation. I think the important thing about that is that we also have to ensure that the emulation is faithful to the original. So it's important for us to not only extract the data, create the emulation, but also compare that emulation version against the original for things like speed of play, a legitimate rendering of the graphics. And I think the other important thing that ACMI tries to do too, as Cynde pointed out, is that we're interested in collecting the ephemera as well. We want to be able to present a future audience the entire experience of what it was like to experience the game in the original period. And I think probably, Helen, you'll touch on this in more detail, but one of the other things we find, and we found this very much in the original Play It Again project, where we preserved a quite astounding number of Australian games that were made in the 1980s, is that the social memory is also really important. That it's one thing to be able to present a playable emulation of a game from the period, but it's quite another thing to understand what it was like to play that game in that original period. As Cynde pointed out, to unpack the box, to have to look at the manual, to, in the case of the 90s, the 80s games, less so the 90s, to negotiate with your siblings over the use of the single television that sat in your living room. You know, they tell us as much about the social experience of gameplay as being able to play the emulation does. So it's a really multifaceted preservation project requiring not just the technical expertise to preserve the code, the technical expertise to preserve the original hardware, but also then to wrap in and around that some sort of understanding of what the social experience of playing games in that period was, and particularly what it meant to suddenly emerge into a period where you could network games, something that we absolutely take for granted these days was an entirely new experience in the 90s. So it requires a real collaborative effort, and it requires a whole host of skills across a really broad spectrum of the conservation and preservation activities. So it's a big job. It's incredibly rewarding. It requires a lot of innovation. It requires a lot of experimentation, and part and parcel of that is that you know, we fail as many times as we succeed, and with every failure we learn how to avoid the next failure and so on. So it's you know, it's groundbreaking work in many aspects.
Thank you, Nick. I think that you raised some really critical points about the diversity of the team that's required to do this kind of work, and how we're drawing on skills from a global community of games preservationists to do this project. And at this point, it'd be really great to hear from Denise, who is part of that global community, and to get her to talk through some of the major breakthroughs and the major techniques that are being used in the preservation of worn digital history. So Denise, if you would like to introduce some of the work that you've been involved with and some of the techniques that you've seen developed around games preservation.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, as Helen mentioned, I'm a member of the UNESCO Persist Technology Group, and as an international group from, I think, 35 countries, it's a small group, we are trying to get support from various software companies and develop protocols and policies and techniques to preserve software so that we can, in the future, you know, render all sorts of digital assets. In this project in particular, we're looking at video games, which are a very complex piece of software. It's not that you have a software running and then you bring in files. We've got it all encompassing, and it's very complex. So we've got the different components, the music, the graphics, the networking, the intelligence, the games engines, etc., and they're a whole, they're a complete unit, and that makes it very difficult then to preserve and to make sure that in the future we can still experience these wonderful objects. On top of that, we've got games that rely on third-party components, and so they have been brought in, but we don't necessarily have access to the intricacies of those third-party components. So we've got the various drivers for the graphics cards, the sound cards, the drivers for the monitors, and so on and so forth. This makes it all much more complex to do the technical preservation of these objects. To do this, we need to have, you know, a forensic examination of the files of the objects that we have. So we have to look through as much documentation as we can. So hopefully, you know, especially in the 90s, things arrived with boxes and you got system requirements, etc., on them. But people also made slight changes. There's a difference between minimal requirements and recommended requirements and what you need for best gameplay. So people would go and buy or build special game machines. And then, of course, you had the game consoles, which were dedicated to that. And so we need to be able to look through and see exactly what drivers were needed or were for best performance, and that includes the version, the date of release, you know, whether one release was a lot better than another, get hold of those things so we can recreate the environment, etc., etc. And then we have, of course, dependency hell, as it's known, where slight updates in an operating system can completely change or, you know, ruin the running of a game or even stop it. And so Microsoft and Macintosh were really good at making slight changes to their libraries and extensions so that the internal address actually changed. And so when there was a call from the executable file to a specific address, it didn't work anymore. And so you would have to backtrack and try and figure out exactly which version, which rendering, which service pack for Windows you were dealing with. And this goes too for the various drivers, etc., etc. So this takes a lot of study. We're trying to develop tools that will do this automatically because at the moment it's all very manual. So part of this project is to build tools that will recognise these small changes and dependencies within the executables so that we can build environments that properly represent what the environment should be for the optimal execution of these games. And part of the problem, as I see it, was that game producers were always at the bleeding edge of technology. They wanted to absolutely maximise the latest developments in technology. And so the games, especially developed in the 1990s, used every single technological development they could to produce the best games. Video game developers are probably the best at using graphics and making the most of the screen real estate, making the most of animation, right? So these are also very resource hungry. And so we've got this, you know, looking back, you realise how innovative games developers were in you know, getting every little bit that could count to put into a game. So software preservation in general is a three-pronged attack. We have the technologies, we have the experiences, and we have the digital assets. Now, Nick has pretty much already talked about the experience, and that's very important. So I'll just run through the different technologies that are needed for software preservation. We need to know, as I said, all about the operating system. What was it? What was the release? What were the components, etc., etc. We need to know what the hardware was. We need to know, you know, every component, every connection, etc., etc. We need to know what all the communication protocols were so that we know, you know, sort of what the network protocols were, what the COM ports were, etc., etc., etc. Was in the early 90s, not a lot was thought about with regard to security, but certainly by the late 90s, there was a lot more to do with security. So we need to know what security aspects there were in the execution, especially on networked games. And we bring all this together to be able to create the perfect environment for either virtualization and emulation. Now, I won't go through the difference of what those two things mean, but let's just concentrate on emulation. They're very similar. And so in emulation, we recreate as closely as possible the hardware environment and operating system environment to be able to run these old digital objects, right? And Cynde will take you through more of that in a minute. As well, we've got the digital assets that we have to be able to preserve all this as well. And so that includes obviously our digital image of the executable. It also means that we have to have the metadata to describe, to be able to easily configure and recognise and catalogue, etc., what we know about the games. We have ontologies so that we've got a precise description of how all of these things fit together in a logical, meaningful way. We need controlled vocabularies so that everybody in this industry, in this space, knows what every term means. We don't just make up phrases to describe something that are not easily interpreted by everybody in the world. We have databases and knowledge bases that collect all this information in, and if possible, we like to have the source code for the games themselves. So all of these things together make up the world of software preservation. Now, it would be fantastic if we could just recreate everything on original hardware, but that's a dream. It's not possible. We do have hardware available in the computer archaeology lab so that we can try and run the original, run the objects on the original hardware to give us a base standard of how things should run. But these are very hard to maintain. They're also, it's not possible to get all of them. So we go to emulation, right? And so the emulation is the recreation of the hardware by software means. Emulation has been around forever. An operating system is emulation of hardware. It's not new. So emulation has been studied forever, especially with specific games platforms. Emulations have been typically developed by fans, by gamer fans, and they have their own agendas. So a lot of the emulators help the gamer execute on a particular platform or a particular brand of game development. So they're not all equal. Some, you know, have their quality in the video, some have their quality in the logic, etc., etc. So we can't just go and say, yeah, that's going to be the emulator for that machine. This also needs studying. But one development that has come out in the last 10 years is Emulation-as-a-Service, which was developed at the University of Freiburg, and it's a way to capture emulation of hardware and then have a standard image of hardware saved in their framework, and then you can save deltas of those where you install different drivers and graphic cards and sound cards and install software, so that you've got your main computer saved, emulation of a computer saved, and then you can save various deltas of different flavors, if you like. So you could have one genre of game that needs a specific emulator on it and have that run, and it just is a menu picked emulator. And Cynde will go into that in far more detail.
And I think, thank you so much, Denise. I think that's a really good time to throw to Cynde for that more detailed analysis of the emulation process and the disk imaging of our selection of games. So if I could introduce you again to Cynde Moya, and Cynde will take us through some of the games that we've been working on for this project, and she'll tell us about what her and her team have been doing.
Well, hi there, and thank you for having me, and it's my pleasure to be speaking to PAX today. Now, my part in the workflow of this project is testing the disk images of these Australian video games of the 90s in various open source emulators, and then getting the best of these emulators working in the Emulation-as-a-Service tool. Eventually, we'll be comparing these emulated games to the games running on the original equipment. Now, the games are sourced and imaged by a couple of our PhD students. One, Carolyn Chung, is digitizing the CD-ROMs using ImageBurn. She's dumping the ROMs using the Infinite Lives NES INL Retro Dumper Programmer and the GBC GBA Reader Writer Gen 3, which are both kind of hobbyist-made things. Our other student, Michael Borthwick, is using a CryoFlux to image 5.25 and 3.5-inch floppy disks, and he'll also be using an applesauce to image the Apple disks when we get there. We share these digital images, log files, technical notes, and requirements, digitized manuals, screenshots, install and gameplay videos, and other paratextual materials in a Dropbox and Vimeo channel. Many of these assets will eventually populate the project website. We've chosen about 50 Australian video games for this project. Now, I will use 3 case studies to focus on what has emerged so far. The games I'm going to be looking at are Aussie Rules Footy for the NES that came out in 1991, Krush Kill and Destroy, or KKND, for DOS in 1997, and the Team Fortress Quake mod, which was for the PC, maybe Windows 95, 98, came out in 1996. So, Aussie Rules Footy. Like so much game preservation, the tools to digitize or dump these game ROMs are made by hobbyists and enthusiasts, just like you in the audience. These labors of love are usually not plug and play, require some complex technical configuration, and are transitory, coming and going with the changing interests of their developers. Now, Carolyn used the Infinite Lives NES INL Retro Dumper Programmer to dump the ROM for this game. This INL Retro is a printed circuit board with 6 different connectors for the different Nintendo cartridges. It pairs with open source software that works on Windows and Linux. This ROM dumper provides only the binary ROM image, which must be edited to add header information. I tested our image of Aussie Rules Footy in several open source emulators. These emulators are also labors of love, built, tested, and maintained by an enthusiastic group of hobbyists for their specific platform. Therefore, they're also at risk of being lost to changing interests and drop domains. Now, Aussie Rules Footy worked best in Meson, thought to be the most accurate NES emulator. And you can show that video. I also tried some multi-emulator systems like BizSock, Mednafin, and RetroArch. Now, not unlike Emulation-as-a-Service, these multi-system emulators provide a centralized place and a consistent strategy for configuring and playing video games from several different consoles from one application or user interface. Now, I discovered that BizHawk, optimized for tool-assisted speedruns, has a very choppy rendering of the soundtrack. Apparently, that's not important for tool-assisted speedruns. And Mednafin was also very choppy in the sound. RetroArch worked very well, probably because the emulator it uses for the NES games is Meson. So my next step for Aussie Rules Footy is to get the open source Meson emulator containerized and made available in our Emulation-as-a-Service instance. Now, KKND is a DOS game, came out in 1997. It has a very different set of problems that, Denise was addressing this. KKND is the first of 3 post-apocalyptic real-time strategy games by Beam Software. This game was digitized from its CD-ROM using ISOBuster. The game illustrates, trying to get this game to work illustrates a common 1990 software problem, the system requirements. Technology was rapidly changing in this decade. There's this huge variety of add-on software like sound cards, 3D graphics boards, accelerators that needed to be purchased, installed, and configured. Just like today, everyday gamers in the 90s had to become expert in this kind of home computer troubleshooting and updating just to get started. Now, the other 2 KKND games installed just fine in our Windows 98 SE running in Emulation-as-a-Service. Now, EAAS uses QEMU, or QEMU, an open source emulator and virtualizer to run DOS and Windows systems. But I hit a problem. The first KKND will not install on this Windows 98 SE. The program asks for UniVBE for the Visa driver, then crashes when it cannot find it. After some research, I found that QEMU, although a good system, is not so great for pre-Windows XP emulation. It doesn't have options for the 3D graphics boards that were so important for 90s games, and its approach to graphics drivers is lacking for our purposes. Now, KKND runs just fine in DOSBox. This mature program has a best practice for choosing the optimal CPU and sound drivers. Perhaps not unlike what Denise is proposing, the automatic forensic examination of disk images to extract and act on the system requirements without any intervention by the person trying to install the game. So until then, my forensic analysis uses such analog methods as studying the requirements printed on the side of the box, reading the installation and troubleshooting instructions in the game manual, and examining the README file from the installed game itself. And there's also plenty of Googling of error messages. Now, I'm getting ready to test KKND in another emulator called PCM, which emulates many more of the graphic, sound, and CPU configurations that 90s games require. For example, it has a Voodoo soundboard and a lot of different VGA and SVGA graphics drivers. I feel very hopeful about PCM, which is also open source, and we will soon be adding it to our EAAS instance. Now, the final example is Team Fortress Quake mod, which came out for the PC, Windows, in 1996. So we digitized Quake from a CD-ROM using ISOBuster. We found several versions of the Team Fortress mod online. Quake works just fine on our emulated Windows 98 SE in Emulation-as-a-Service, although I'm still struggling to get the mod installed and working. It might be made for more contemporary computers rather than Windows 98. Now, this game requires a server on which multiple people can play as a team, which is the whole point of the game. Currently, the Emulation-as-a-Service implementation we are building is not going to be setting up servers or supporting multiplayer games. Now, the EASY project is planning on building network configurations, so it will eventually be possible, but not for a couple of years. Meanwhile, our emulated Team Fortress Quake mod will be a solo look at the game. Researchers will be able to look at the roles, weapons, maps, control, mood, animation, music, navigation, and other aspects of the game, but will not be able to experience the excitement of multiplayer gameplay. Now, this has been solved by some hobbyists, for example, at fortress1.org, who have revived the game. It can be downloaded free of charge, and they have several servers available for multiplayer games. It's very fun and exciting to play online with multiple people. So there's some illustrations of the difficulties that we're having. Each of these games has its own challenge that must be solved. Sometimes the emulation works, and sometimes a considerable amount of configuration and research is necessary. Now, this is one of the great strengths of Emulation-as-a-Service. Is once the environments have been made, it is ready for reuse and even sharing across institutions. So this mountain only has to be climbed once, ideally. And that makes it a real game changer in emulating games. and other media arts. Thank you so much.
That was fantastic, and it was really interesting to hear about all the various idiosyncrasies of the different games through the capture. There are like two really exciting points that you raised there that we're going to deal with. Firstly, we're going to talk to Nick and Candice about what it actually means for a collection to take in this software. I mean, this is not a box that sits on the shelf. So how do they deal with this? And what does it mean to have a software in your collection that must constantly be moved to the next operating system to be accessed? And then we want to catch up with Seb and ask him, what are institutions trying to achieve with emulation as a service? And what happens with the limitations of things like where you can only have a single player, multiplayer game? And is that preservation? And talk about some of the challenges there. So I'd like to introduce Nick Richardson and Candice Cranmer to come and talk to some of the methods they're using around games preservation in the collection.
I'll start us off, I think, Nick. So I think everyone's touched on the complexities that are involved in this, in the process all along the way. And I think that that can be a really critical step to start with. So what is the object? What is the video game? How are we going to, what format is it? How is it being compiled? How bespoke is it? What are those hardware modifications that Seb suggested at the start of this conversation? So in the case that we have an optical disc, and we know that it's a CD-ROM, we'll take it through a triage and condition reporting process, and we're looking for any potential deterioration catalysts, such as mechanical damage and scratches. And we're also looking for ephemeral agents of deterioration, association. So if anyone still has a CD collection like I do, they'll know how easy it is to put the wrong disc in a case. And for a museum, and that can be a real disaster. Then we're looking to conservation treatments if the carriers appear to be suffering from any deterioration. And then, as Denise said, we need to have a forensic look at the disc. So how do we find out what format is on the disc, what software is required to run the disc, and platforms, and how can we analyze the disc? So we're looking at software like ISObuster, as everyone suggested. And then obviously the workflow to fit into migration. We're using two sort of platforms. We're using an Acronova NIMBY, which is allowing us to rip discs at scale, but then we're also looking at smaller scale ripping with ISObuster, and that's involving migration and then a process of sort of checksumming and verification, which is continual. So that process never stops. And then obviously the emulation, as Cynde suggested. Some of the processes that we use also are involving cataloging, metadata collection, which is integral to ongoing access to the discs. And other conservation processes like our preservation questionnaire. So direct access to the artists means that we can have these conversations around the parameters of preservation for these titles and discs. And also collecting contextual information about documentation of gameplay, manuals, packaging, and scanning of all of that documentation and adding that to our system as well. Yeah.
Candice, does the added complexity of this kind of software artifact, is that new for your collections, where you're constantly, where you've got no longer dealing with just a single object or an artifact or a film in a case, but you're dealing with many fragmented parts that are all interdependent on each other? Does that create new challenges around like communication and depth of knowledge? Because people like you are very new to the museum sector.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. I think, as Seb said, all of these hardware modifications and graphics cards and as Cynde said, just knowing some of those nuances between contemporary platforms. How do we know those things? We're sort of reliant on this interconnected system of network of people and projects like this to harness this sort of knowledge. So yeah, it obviously changes, and we're continually learning. It's an ongoing process.
I think the other thing, Helen, too, that's important there is, as you alluded to, we're no longer just keeping the digital file. We've got to keep an emulator that allows the emulation to run. In many cases, we've got to keep multiple emulators. So the related objects that we also need to be mindful of, collect, not necessarily preserve, grows exponentially. And I think, as Cynde pointed out really succinctly, is we are in many cases heavily dependent on the fan base for these works, because they were creating hacks, they were creating emulations, they were maintaining emulators, and they're vulnerable because as time passes, we're losing the fan base, the original fan base. We're losing expertise. Those important files that we will harvest from fan sites are at the whim of whoever's maintaining the domain. So it's raised a whole host of issues, not only in terms of the practical collection activities and the fact that we now need to collect so much more around in this case, the game we're trying to preserve. But it's challenged an organisation like ours in terms of rights. In the 1980s preservation project, we relied really heavily on being able to harvest Spectrum and Commodore 64 games from fan sites. Now, there's no doubt that they were generated illegally at the time, but fortunately the passage of time has really turned those illegal activities into preservation activities. So as a national government-funded cultural institution, we had to look at how that impacted our risk aversion and our risk appetite around rights. And I think the other thing that Denise pointed out that's become just absolutely critical to Candice and myself is the knowledge base, so that the undeniable experts like Cynde and Denise leave behind the legacy of their knowledge in those knowledge bases, so that we as managers and conservators can dive back into that. And also the notion of controlled vocabularies. And I think both with this project and the one before it, we saw the controlled vocabularies around formats and file types grow significantly as we needed to add all these new elements into a collection management system that for many years was geared towards what we would call single channel moving image works, films and videos, and the complexity of what we're collecting and preserving now necessitated a real growth in that area.
Thanks, Nick. I think looking at that, what it means to collect digital objects, I think we might move and ask Seb what that actually means to exhibit digital objects and how that's changing our understanding of the museum and the access point for the museum. So not just the collection of digital objects in perpetuity, but how we now exhibit those. So Seb, if I can ask you to talk a little bit to the vision for Emulation-as-a-Service, and also for some of the other things that ACMI might be exploring with its online audiences.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, look, as the National Museum of Screen to Culture, we see really that it's not only the preservation of video games and the stories that they tell and the stories that players and fan communities have. It's also our ability to exhibit those and to give those objects and games and items and stories a place where people can talk about them and reminisce, and also perhaps remix and hack and modify those in kind of to the future. And it was interesting you talking about the dark rain community that's still going on now. You know, this is nearly 25 years later. There's some amazing communities around these kind of titles and many other titles. And I think for us, what Emulation as a Service, what's exciting about that is it also provides the infrastructure potentially for a proper national collection. We already have an MO kind of U with the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, commonly known as the Powerhouse Museum up in Sydney, which has a large collection of computing in their collection, as well as the NFSA in Canberra. So this sort of notion of a game being able to be collected, played and explored across 3 sites, at least 3 physical sites at kind of least, is very exciting. And we would hope that Emulation as a Service, pending legislative changes around the Copyright Act, or perhaps some changes in community perception, would also allow things like the Internet Archive's been doing in America with browser-based play and an emulation of games that way. You know, museums are safe houses. They're safe houses for our communities. But what's important is they need to be accessible safe houses. They can't just preserve things and they're locked away forever. Preservation and access are deeply tied kind of together, and I think that's a really exciting place to be. It's particularly important now because Australia's got such a thriving video game making community now, which is sort of reborn and carries a lot of those same smaller scale communities and communities of developers that are very similar to those of the 1980s. So it's an exciting time. Watch this space. We hope to launch our building soon, and you at PAX will be amongst the first to know when.
Thank you, Seb. And we're all looking forward to ACMI reopening in all its formats, opening online and in the real world. I just have a question, because Emulation as a Service obviously has this incredible value in creating a game that's playable that we can then share with other organisations, and they don't need to have the expertise at hand. But how does it balance with the preservation practice of locks, and maybe which is like lots of copies, keep software safe? And maybe either Denise or Cynde could speak to that.
Locks project is really just proposing that you make lots of copies of your digital image. It doesn't necessarily mean you have lots of environments in which to run software, but it ensures that you have quite a collection of copies of things, so that if something goes wrong with where it's been stored, you've got it stored somewhere else. But it's not related at all to emulation.
So that they're complementary, like museums will keep multiple copies, multiple museums will keep multiple copies, yet Emulation as a Service is about access.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I think we're almost running out of time, so I would love to go around the panel and ask everybody what they think is most exciting, what they're most excited about this project, and what they hope to achieve in their area. I mean, I'm obviously very excited about going forward and working with local games developers on recording their history and talking to the fan communities locally and globally when we get our website up for that too, to get their history, so that becomes part of this narrative, part of this story of Australian games. But maybe I could throw to Candice and Nick and hear their thoughts.
I'm excited to see how people interact with the games that they may not have seen for many years. I think that'll be thrilling.
Yeah, well, I'm incredibly fortunate that as we move into the preservation of more complex objects, we've got expertise at our disposal, and I think everyone who's listened to Denise and Cynde will see the level of expertise that's required to undertake this work. So that's exciting now. And like you, Helen, I think it's going to be great to collect the social memory around what it was like to play the games at the time, because I think that forms a really important part of the experience that an archive should be able to present to a future public. So I'm excited for that.
Cynde?
Well, I'm really excited to be a part of this project, which is really cool and interesting. But what I'm really looking forward to is getting my hands on those computers from the computer archaeology lab and setting them up and making them go and comparing the emulators and the emulated games to the real games on these real computers.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a post-COVID project or a soon project. Denise?
Oh, just so much about this project excites me. I mean, I to be able to preserve the knowledge, I think, of you know, the development of the hardware and of video games. As I said, games programmers were at the bleeding edge and really pushed the technology. So be able to preserve that knowledge of that development of the rationale behind all those things. The games community, you know, to preserve the memories and the social history of it, I find fascinating. You know, having ACMI, you know, to be able to go to ACMI and actually relive those experiences will be fantastic. You know, just all aspects. It's really exciting.
Thank you, Denise. And I'd like to thank the whole panel. I'd like to thank Candice and Nick from the collections at ACMI, Seb from the curatorial team at ACMI, and Denise and Cynde, who are our technical team on the project, on the Play It Again 2 project. And thank you all for joining us here today. I hope you found it interesting, and we look forward to your contribution when we have more information online. So thank you, everyone. Thanks. Thanks, team.